This is Gene Lance on the Workers Beat, and I cornered historian Dr. Michael Phillips this morning, and it's Black History Month. Are you into Black history, Dr. Phillips?
Well, I mean, I always have to challenge that term a little bit because I feel like African American history is American history. And one of the things that bothers me about the month is it essentially cordons off the story of African Americans into one side. It's like chapters in textbooks. They'll say this happened, that happened, and so on. Oh, and by the way, there were Black people, there were Latinx people, there were women. And the way I've always taught it, the Black story is threaded through because I've always seen African Americans as the central actors in American history. Slavery warped American labor markets. Slavery was involved in the first big exports from America. The bloodiest war in American history was fought over slavery and nothing but slavery. The terrorism and violence that has stained America was largely as a result of trying to suppress Black political rights afterwards. We created two separate school systems in states like Texas, as an extenuation of white supremacy. And by the way, those Black freedom fighters who fought for the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill, et cetera, actually benefited everyone in the United States, white working class, middle class, et cetera. And so their freedom struggle was the struggle to make America closer to a genuine democracy. And we haven't gotten there yet. So it's the essence, and I don't see it as separate from American history itself.
Yeah, but there's an article in today's Washington Post about the guy who originally started Black History Week.
Mm-hmm.
I think his name might have been Edmondson or something. It's been a few minutes since I read it. But at that time, this was in 1931 or something like that. At that time, when there was no mention of African Americans in history at all,
right?
It was prizing the door open,
right?
to begin to say something. So it was a very good thing when he came up with it.
Sure.
But today, we're at a point now, I think you're saying, that we should see Black history as an integral part of all American history, right?
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, an American culture is Black culture. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois said that in The Souls of Black Folk, that there's basically no true American art but Black art. And I would say that politics of the United States have centered on African Americans. And by the way, the American obsession with race and racism has been the way the ruling class has diverted attention from the class struggle and has divided workers. And that's been a central part of American class politics. So yeah, I want the greater emphasis, and I think it's really obvious what's happened in the last few months with this full-on assault on what's just broadly labeled critical race theory, which is any discussion of racism at all. That the country is undergoing a transformation. It's uncertain. A more diverse population doesn't guarantee a more just or inclusive society necessarily. But it's clear there's a fear there, and that they want to erase Black history now, which is what this panic about CRT is really about. Because they want to erase a useful past. They don't want stories of resistance being part of the school curriculum. When I wrote my book on Dallas White Metropolis, I went through 100 years of Dallas approved school textbooks, many of them written outside of the state of Texas. And that was racial propaganda. That was politics in the form of textbooks. Those books were basically conveyor belts of white supremacist ideas. They ridiculed Black people. They said they had had no cultural achievements in Africa, that their story was the suffering of slavery was erased, the Klan was minimized. And so the claim that somehow textbooks now, which still aren't very good, are basically the introduction of political propaganda into the schoolhouse is laughable, because it always has been. School textbooks have always been about promoting racist ideas, and it's only recently, with the work of scholars from the African American community, the Latinx community, the gay community, and so on, that you've actually had a greater accuracy in those books. So it's a real tragedy.
Seems like a good time to plug your book.
Oh, thank you.
Metropolis. And I would like to say thank you, if I haven't before, because prior to this book, I found literally nothing about race, about Black history in the whole history of Dallas. And everything you looked at about Dallas was just a giant hole where there was nothing. And then you stepped in with your book, White Metropolis. What's your opinion of the literature now? Do you think Dallas is well covered?
A lot of work still needs to be done. I will applaud a book by a woman named Patricia Hill, a great scholar, who
Everidge Hill. She wrote Dallas, a Modern and Industrial City.
Yeah, and her book covered the labor movement and covered important figures on the left, and labor strikes that most Dallasites don't know about. They don't know Dallas had a Ford factory, and there was a strike, and Ford used goons basically to assault the striking workers. The textile workers strike in Dallas. She did a wonderful job of uncovering working class history, and that's even less explored than Dallas's racist past. That it just almost completely erased.
I'll tell you a funny story about that. The guy who was in charge of the Dallas AFL-CIO at that time was named Gene Freeland, who's passed on now. But I let him read my copy of Patricia Hill's book, Dallas, the Making of a Modern Industrial City. He went out and bought 15 copies and gave them away to the leadership of the AFL-CIO just on his own.
Yeah.
So, that was a very exciting, as a milestone for labor history in Dallas. But your book, White Metropolis, I think filled a hole that was even more gigantic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think we have to all be alarmed at the censorship that's happening, because it's been such a struggle to get those stories out in the first place, and to have all that effort erased will leave, I think, we'll talk about my situation later, but it will leave anyone teaching at the college level with a group of students who'll be the least informed in a century. And my students already come to my classes not knowing what a labor union is, not knowing what a strike is, or they know, but they have a negative connotation with it. They've never heard of the AFL-CIO. They've never heard of.
And they think the Texas Rangers were all heroes.
Right. Oh yeah. No, if they've heard of the Rangers at all, that's how poorly, what a big gap there is. And it's not their fault. It's ignorance by design. Once these students hear these stories, they hear about the great strikes, Homestead Mills, and all that. They're really gripped by those stories. And when I've had labor activists speak at the college, it really is inspiring to many of my students. So there's an effort to make that impossible.
Would you mind talking just a minute about your resume, because I noticed that you have quite a lot of output beyond just the book, White Metropolis, academic research and academic papers, things that you've done to contribute to history.
Well, I did a book focusing on the history of the Texas House speakers. That was actually commissioned work, but I think that that's an office that's overlooked. People look at the governor and lieutenant governor, but it really is an epicenter of power, and of course, very much influenced by corporate donations, the corporate elites in the class. So that was called The House Will Come to Order. We did a collection of essays. Some of my colleagues at Colin College and I called the Texas Right. And I looked at racism as a unifying principle in right-wing politics in Texas. There were other essays and anti-New Dealers and other right-wing activists, right-wing ministers, and so on. That book was pretty effective. I'm currently doing a book with my co-author, who's my wife, Betsy Freehoff, on the history of eugenics in Texas, and that movement was aimed at selectively breeding humans to produce a superior human race, but it was also really expressly anti-working class. The working class as a group was perceived as biologically inferior, and there was a big effort to disenfranchise all but the wealthy, to really codify once again rule only by the wealthiest legally, to disenfranchise marginal, people who are seen as marginally white. And so that's our big focus right now, is working on that book. And it's
But you're being interrupted by Colin College itself, which has sort of made a bad name for itself by firing and discontinuing some of their instructors. Are you one of the victims?
Yeah, I just recently got informed that my contract will not be renewed. We have a member of the elected board of trustees in Colin College back in 2015 at a Tea Party event. He was asked about, how do you make sure teachers or professors at the college teach Americanism? And he said, well, we don't have tenure. He said, we have a contract system, and that's by design, because when you have tenure, your socialist, anti-capitalist professors become entrenched, and you can't get rid of them. And I mean,
he was saying that they can get rid of you.
Yeah. It's he's saying, yeah. So he's saying, yeah, we can get rid of, he's saying that we have contracts so we can purge those professors.
The most important thing, let me interrupt you, because I want to get this most important thing in at the last, that there's going to be a fight back over this. You're not just going to go quietly.
No, right? We're going to sue. We're going to sue. The tipping point was literally, I recommended masks to my students because of COVID. Mm-hmm. And that was the final thing, after they've been after me since I advocated the removal of Confederate statues. So this has been an ongoing struggle for free speech. We've had 4 professors fired over free speech issues in the last 2 years.